You're amazing, and it's been a pleasure working under you. Secondly, I'd like to thank my parents. Everyone knows I would not be here without them. More ways than one. And I would just really like to thank them for their continuous support and love that made me the man I am today. Third, I'd like to thank the tournament directors and, of course, our judges sitting in front of me. This has been an incredible tournament, and it's truly an honor to debate in front of you. And lastly, I'd like to thank my partner, Brian. It's very special to have a partnership the way we do, because to me, Brian isn't just a partner, he's a best friend. So, thank you. Are all our judges ready? And of course, Brian. Okay. We negate observation 1, futility of actions. The affirmative also has an additional burden to prove that success is a good thing for the people of the country on balance, meaning that if the United Nations operations are successful in fulfilling their mandate and create an environment worse than the status quo, you negate. Contention 1, UN success is worse. According to the International Peace Institute, should offensive peacekeepers in the Democratic Republic of the Congo be successful, Congolese forces will be left to consolidate any gains. Moreover, a UN report finds that the Congolese forces are guilty of humanitarian atrocities equal to, if not worse, than the very militant groups who wanted to stop. This is exemplified by The Guardian in the report on a young Congolese soldier's accounts of the crimes he and his comrades committed. 25 of us gathered together and said we should rape 10 women each, and we did it. He said, I've raped 53 women and children of 5 or 6 years old. He further explains the rationale of many of the Congolese army. When we arrived here, we met a lot of women, and we could do whatever we wanted. Holistically, the Human Rights Watch finds that this mentality has resulted in tens of thousands of women and girls suffering horrific acts of sexual violence at the hands of the government army. These incidents are carried out by a Congolese army being fed, transported, and otherwise supported by the United Nations. The Boston Globe explains local residents frequently complain that the Congolese army subject them to another wave of the same violence they experienced under militia rule. For residents mugged and marauded and shot by marauding gunmen, it makes no difference whether the overlords wear the insignia of the militia or of the government. The government pressures the United Nations to criticize only the rebels. In October, it expelled the UN mission's top human rights official after he released a report on the National Police Force abuses. The impact is clear. The UN creates an environment worse than the one they intervened in. Because the government can be more belligerent with an international backer like the United Nations, Brett Leeds of Emory University finds that the probability of conflict initiation by government is 47% higher. Contention 2, overstretch. Offensive operations by peacekeepers will ultimately overstretch UN operations and lead to major infrastructural failures. Overall, offensive operations that are larger tend to be much more costly. In addition, the mandate system of the UN operations are becoming increasingly complex, as the Government Accountability Office finds that as peacekeepers are engaging in different mandates, such as offensive ones, the complexity of requirements within those mandates is increasing. The trend of more expensive offensive operations will not be sustainable in the future. For example, the GAO furthers that it took an entire year just to add one more peace enforcement unit to a mission in Haiti. The impact of an unsustainable peacekeeping system is catastrophic. First, the Century Foundation notes that peacekeeping overstretch can limit the troop deployment to countries around the world because governments are weary to commit troops on too many deployments. Second, physical overstretch on the battlefield. As the Center on International Cooperation notes that currently overstretch of peacekeeping forces has left peacekeepers in a density of 1 soldier per 50 square miles. This is quite problematic, as Wayne State University notes that is 8 times below the threshold for a successful operation. Ultimately, the system is ready to collapse, as Richard Gowan of the FES concludes that the flaws in the peacekeeping system resemble those in the financial system prior to 2008. For example, the International Diplomacy and Public Policy Center notes that the past peacekeeping failures are partially responsible for a massacre of over 1 million people. Contention 3, conflict escalation. Peacekeepers that conduct offensive operations drastically escalate conflicts for several reasons. First, Wayne State University finds that the use of force in peacekeeping operations undermines impartiality, which can downgrade credibility and trustworthiness. The option of peace is thus foregone, and peacekeepers are vulnerable to retaliation. Second, Philip Heyman of Harvard University notes that violence in any form sets a cycle of revenge. Ultimately, more civilians suffer during offensive operations. Wayne State University finds that when peacekeepers are allowed to use force for purposes other than self-defense, we see that there's a 1,681 more civilian deaths per year. And moreover, Virginia Ford of Columbia University finds that the risk of war is 90% higher when peacekeepers are conducting offensive operations. Thank you. Please be. Take a little bit of time. Before I begin, I just want to make a couple thank yous. I'll be brief. I want to firstly thank my coach, Mr. Rywell, who, when I was a freshman, was the first year my school had a speech and debate program, but in my senior year now we have over 100 members. He's a fantastic man, and he's a fantastic coach, a great role model. I also want to thank my partner, Belen Mella, and my partner who graduated last year, Jonathan Wallach, who have been one of the biggest influences on my debate career, and I have a fantastic relationship with both of them, and I can call both of them my best friends. So with that, I'll start the debate. Belen and I affirm, we observe that the resolution posits two alternative worlds. One where the UN peacekeepers have the power to engage in offensive operations, and one where they do not. You as judges must choose which world, the pro or the con, that the UN should exist in. As the UN was founded to save succeeding generations from the scourges of war, it should exist in the world where the UN could have or can prevent conflict. Contention 1 is preventing civil conflict. Offensive operations allow peacekeepers to prevent civil conflict through three unique ways. 1. Offensive operations are needed to compensate for military shortcomings of host governments. The Center of Conflict Prevention finds offensive operations are absolutely vital in the success of the UN peacekeeping mission because of the characteristics of conflict-prone areas. Conflict is highly prone to occur in developing countries where the government cannot contain violence as a result of poor military capabilities. Consequently, peacekeepers need to be able to utilize offensive operations to compensate for a lack of military effectiveness of a host government in order to create peace and neutralize sources of conflict. 2. Granting offensive operation permission eliminates current confusion regarding the use of force. The University of Vermont finds peacekeepers have traditionally been hesitant, regardless of their mandates, to use force as a result of confusions regarding what justifies the use of force and the fear of legal repercussions. In fact, they show that 80% of the time when peacekeepers had a defensive mandate, they failed to take action to save civilian lives. Yet, offensive operations uniquely solve for these shortcomings. A recent UN report regarding the mission in the Congo, which authorized offensive operations, notes the granted capability to conduct offensive operations has been key in removing ambiguities about what is authorized and what is expected regarding the use of force. 3. The Guardian explains that without offensive operations, peacekeepers would investigate claims of abuses by rebels in villages, but as soon as they got to the villages, the rebels would leave and simply return after the peacekeepers left because the peacekeepers could not pursue the rebels. As a result of these three reasons, there are two impacts. First, and as UCLA explains, offensive operations cause a 31% decrease in civilian casualties because conflict is ultimately reduced, minimizing collateral damage. Secondarily, the University of Arkansas explains that peacekeepers granted offensive capabilities reduce conflict by 63%. Intention 2, preventing genocide. Subpoint A, Rwanda. CNN reports that before the Rwandan genocide took place, the UN learned of massive weapon stockpiles that were used to carry out the genocide. But peacekeepers didn't act. As they stated when asked to attack the stockpiles, we cannot agree to the operation contemplated, as it clearly goes beyond our mandates. Yet, we see that with offensive operations, it would be uniquely solved. Furthermore, offensive operations transitions away from restricting mandates. As UN peacekeepers are stationed in areas where conflict is brewing, they can act to prevent genocide preemptively. Foreign Affairs notes UN peacekeepers in Rwanda stood by as Hutus slaughtered Tutsis because their mandate didn't allow them to protect civilians. There is one impact, and that's the ability to prevent genocide. The University of Kansas explains that had peacekeepers conducted offensive operations in Rwanda, nearly 90% of the casualties would have been averted, and that's roughly 1 million lives being saved. Subpoint B, the Central African Republic. According to the Huffington Post, ethnic and religious tensions in the CAR are at an all-time high, and the leading international organizations to report and say that they are on the verge of genocide. At least 2,000 people have been killed in ethnic conflict, 1 million displaced, and due to the fighting, 3.2 million have no access to health care. Further, and reminiscent of Rwanda,
IB Times reports just 3 days ago that weapons stockpiles have been exposed in the CAR. United Nations Offensive Forces can solve this. Defense Web reports that the UN is planning to authorize another force intervention brigade in the CAR. This would consist of 10,000 soldiers and 820 police, and this offensive operations can attack the stockpiles, prevent genocide, and save potentially millions of lives. And for these reasons, because we're preventing conflict, I urge a pro-battle.
What prospects are Guardian Carters? The Guardian Carters.
Genocide is being carried out, there's hate before and after and during, right?
Sure, but during, would you say that it's most escalated?
I think naturally if conflict is being committed, then
so
tensions have escalated.
Would you rather go in to a teetering genocidal regime that is ready to commit genocide with an offensive strike?
Okay, well first of all, the reason why we need to act preemptively is because they're stockpiling weapons. Once they use those stockpiles of weapons, they can commit genocide very quickly. That's why we need to preempt the actions.
Sure, but wouldn't it expedite the process? Sure, go for it.
All right. So when does the military have the most leverage and presence in a country?
Have the most leverage?
Yeah, like when are there the most soldiers on the street? When are they armed the most? When are they
when they're in compliance with the government in the
like when there's conflict, right? Generally, like when countries are at war, the military has the most power in the country, right? So
I would tend to disagree because sometimes, like in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the only reason why their army or the military has the biggest majority and the most strength is because they're being backed by the United Nations.
Well, no. First of all, they've had strength, and those allegations about sexual rights abuse. My response to this very shortly. They've existed before the UN intervention. Okay, what I'm trying to get at is that the root conflict is what causes the Democratic Republic of Congo's army to have such a presence. So if we solve the root problem, they won't need so many soldiers, and we see the prices decline. Yeah.
Alright, so let's quickly talk about the last point you touched on, right before you said that they can solve the problem, about the atrocities of the region. Right? So what we show you is it's not the atrocities themselves, it's the fact that they're going on and the United Nations is backing them on all of their actions.
Okay, first of all, the United Nations is remaining impartial to what they stand for. They stand for the reduction of conflict. The United Nations, in several instances, act independently of the Congolese army to conduct offenses against rebels, right? Rebels, and we actually can read you evidence saying, on a comparative basis, rebels commit more human rights atrocities than the Congolese army. The areas they control have periodically...
I would love to see that because what actually is happening in the status quo is that the United Nations is backing the Congolese army. Insofar as maybe they won't be ideologically on the same page with them, but as long as they're their backer,
what I'm trying to get at is that the Congolese army will not have as much of a presence in the country once conflict is reduced, because there won't be a need for so many soldiers. There won't be a need to arm them so heavily, because they're not going to be fighting against anyone, right? The rebels will be disarmed, right? So then the presence of the military will have to be reduced, right? I'm saying the United Nations solves for the root cause of the strong presence of the Congolese army and all of arms of these rebel groups.
So you're saying in order to solve the entire issue, all you have to do is solve the conflict?
Exactly, because then the army itself won't commit so many human rights abuses because they won't have that much leverage in the country, and rebel groups will be
We'll talk about that.
Okay.
You got everything you need.
reason why you negate on face, for two reasons. First, the perpetrators, this perpetrates the mindset that just because conflict is over, the UN-backed countries can do whatever they want. Second, it's morally okay to ignore human rights abuses as long as the conflict is over. At that point, they're literally saying if the conflict is over, it's good, even if there's tons of rapes happening. But go to my opponent's first contention, where they talk about preventing conflict. Their first warning is that they help the host government. But that isn't good if the host government is corrupt. In fact, the Boston Globe specifically finds that they're turning over land to the Congolese army, which they either A, flee when rebels come, or they commit massive human rights violations, which is what we give you in our first contention. But furthermore, they're not actually solving the conflict. Because when you look to Christopher Vogel of The Guardian, he finds that now there are 40 small factions in the Congo, so when you get rid of one group, it creates a power vacuum, so there's just more violence. But then, my next response is that all of this decrease in violence is due to Rwanda actually decreasing support to the main rebel group. It had nothing to do with the United Nations Brigade. But then my next response is that, again, there's not going to be long-term success because the Life and Peace Institute finds that the brigade is now seen as an occupation force. So now civilians are actually joining rebel groups because they hate the United Nations. In fact, in recent weeks, UN bases have been bombed in the area, and if you ask the average non-government official, he's going to come out and say there was no progress that's been made. They then give you this third warrant saying that they're going to remove ambiguities in the mandate. But acting with caution is always better than actually going to war. Because when you specifically look to the International Peace Institute, they find that when the UN peacekeepers carry out high-pressure operations, because of the fog of war, there are ultimately more civilian casualties. That's where we show you that there's 1,700 more civilian deaths when they actually use enforcement operations. But then they say that you're going to investigate claims. But the Boston Globe actually finds that they're only investigating claims of the rebel groups when they're not investigating claims of the Congolese army. Again, they're condoning rape and they're condoning violations. But furthermore, there's going to be a reason why violence increases. Megan Shannon of FSU actually finds that when third parties, like the UN, intervene, it actually causes the opposing party to go, hey, out of desperation, I'm going to kill more civilians. And that's exactly what's happening in the Congo. 120 people were just massacred in one region. At that point, there's tons of backlash, no long-term success. But let's go to my opponent's second contention on preventing genocide. First, on Rwanda. It never would have been successful because multilateralism takes too long. The Henry Stimson Center finds that multilateralism takes too long because governments have differing objectives, so they never would have gotten a force on the ground that was trained enough. Furthermore, Sloan actually finds that they don't have the effective leadership, resources, or equipment, so you can't actually change these traditional peacekeepers to offensive forces on the fly. But then, my next response is that overall, it makes the conflict worse. Because Benjamin Valentino of Dartmouth University finds that perpetrators of violence blame the victim for military intervention, so then they actually retaliate and kill more of the victims. That's exactly what happened in Kosovo. Serbs switched from a policy of counterinsurgency to ethnic cleansing when NATO decided to bomb. In fact, Alan Cooperman of Harvard University finds that some militants may rebel, provoking state retaliation. They go, hey, the UN is going to have my back. The only time the UN has had anyone's back is the actual government. So they're the ones who are actually promoting more genocide. But then lastly, they talk about how they're going to solve by getting these arms and collecting weapons. But they overall make the problem worse. In fact, when you look to the United Nations Security Council, they even admit that military operations in the Sahel region has led to an influx of weapons in the region. And the logic is simple. When they come in with a large offensive force, the other side is going to go, hey, we need to build up our arms. That creates more weapons in the region, which has led 3 million people without food, without shelter, which increases insecurity in the long term. And for all these reasons, I can see nothing but a negative ballot. Thank you.
80% of the time letting people die. Go to their first contention where they say that the UN is going to be worse. They try to be tricky and they say that if we win, we're going to get back to the Congo, which is a bad actor. But our first response is that UN peacekeepers actually stay in a region after they win a war. That's why they're called peacekeepers, so don't let all these things happen automatically. But second, the American Institute of Public Health looked into why rapes are so endemic in the Congo, and they found that it's because of a lack of governmental presence. In other words, when you have instability and you have war in a region, rapes are more likely to happen. Judges, these Congolese soldiers aren't inherently bad people. Rather, they're in the backdrop of war, which gives them not only more power, but more reason to rape. But additionally, in their, going on to a third response, look at their card from the Guardian that says that they have so much documents and that's why they feel they want to rape. This was before offensive operations were actually took place in the Congo. So you can completely turn these rapes against our opponents. But additionally, it even turns their warrant. They didn't commit these abuses because they felt so dominant. They committed these abuses because they had just lost a battle. They felt embarrassed, they felt weak, and that's why they went in. If we solve for the conflict, we're actually solving for this. But then Human Rights Watch, fourth response, Human Rights Watch says that the U.S. just granted them $17 million to look into sexual assaults. They started convicting official military leaders, and things are improving overall. But finally, fifth, even if you buy that the Congolese government is so bad, the New York Times tells us that UN offensive operations can uniquely take out bad leaders, take out corrupt leaders, and solve for the problem as a whole. Then on this rights card, about 47% higher, that's not about the UN, and it's about when a challenger is backed by a third party, but in this case, the challenger are the rebels, they're not backed up. Go to their second contention about overstretch. First, there's no link because they don't tell you why the UN offensive operation necessarily has more people than non-offensive one. In the Congo, there's 20,000 soldiers, and only 30,000 of them are offensive. But then the New York Times tells us that whereas defensive peacekeepers were there for 14 years, being humiliated by not being able to act, in only 2 days, the offensive peacekeepers were able to solve the problem. A shorter conflict means less overstretch. But additionally, the Swedish Defense College says that more troops is statistically insignificant as to whether or not you're going to solve the problem. And the Radio Free Europe says that the supply of peacekeepers exceeds the demand, allowing the UN to actually be selective. But then go to the third contention where they talk about conflict escalation. First, the Voice of America finds that there used to be 55 different rebel groups in the Congo, and now there's only 20. M23 is out of the picture because they're being held in camps in Rwanda, and FDR, the second biggest perpetrator of human rights abuses, went from 8,000 troops to only 1,000. They're going to tell you this is because Rwanda stopped backing these people. We give you in our cards causality that it was the UN Offensive Intervention Brigade that actually caused this to happen. But then look when they say from Wayne State that impartiality is going to be important. The UN has a commitment to impartiality, not to neutrality. Impartiality means that like a referee, you go into a region and you don't pick a side. But like a referee, if somebody's committing wrongdoing, you're going to act against them. At that point, drop any negative things because we're not actually seeing this happen. But then they talk about the cycle of revenge, and they continue from Wayne State saying that 1,700 people are going to die. But actually, the author goes on to say that when he controls for his own variables, he finds that more people are saved. 32 people a year are saved when you have offensive interventions. So we've completely turned their case at this point. But now go back to ours. Specifically, go where they tell you this FSU card that says that the rebels, because they feel this desperation, because they're being attacked, are going to start being more aggressive. In fact, the Cato Institute says that when they're being attacked, they're able to shift their focus. No longer are they worried about killing civilians, and now they have to be worried about protecting themselves from UN peacekeepers. This desperation is going to work in our favor because it's going to help them wage warfare, and it's going to help them win the war. And finally, remember, they never respond to our warrants in our second contention as to why preventing the stockpiling of weapons and being able to prevent killing before it starts is crucial to saving the conflict. Vote pro. Ready for that?
Can we see the evidence that says that they're cracking down the convictions?
Yeah.
Sure. So you respond to my case saying that overall impartiality is different than neutrality because you're punishing both sides, right? If they're like acting badly.
The side that as doing wrongdoing.
Okay, so how is the Congo not wrongdoing, like doing bad things right now?
The biggest issue right now in the Congo isn't the Congo's forces, and you never told us that in case.
Actually, I do,
Why are they the biggest issue?
because they raped tens of thousands of women and children.
Okay.
How many people? Wait, how many
Which
people?
side is killing the most people?
I would say probably the Congolese army as well, because the evidence also
Probably?
yes, because the evidence also says that 1,400 civilians literally
So
it's a guy
FDR,
recently
right?
as a result of the Congolese army.
FDR, the second biggest rebel group. Do you know like what they've done in the past?
They've committed massive human
They've
rights violations.
perpetrated the Rwandan genocide.
Yes, they're
And so far
losers.
as we've decreased from 8,000 to 1,000, the rebel numbers of the people who committed the Rwandan genocide, that gives us access to almost 1 million lives. Are they not like a worse offender than the Congolese government?
Not at all, because you can't say that one thing that's so atrocious is worse than another thing. You should be impartial towards both. At the point where they're literally backing a really bad actor that's committing rape, it's still not good that they're not
So let's talk about
condoning
this
a good actor.
Let's
Sure.
talk about this right. The only example you give us at all is from The Guardian, right?
No, I actually give you the UN evidence, the Guardian evidence, the Human Rights Watch evidence, and the
Let's
Boston
talk about
Globe.
the war instead, right?
Okay.
Rape happens when there's a war.
No. In fact, that's a reason to vote for us, because you're perpetuating the mindset that when we solve conflict, then all of these atrocities are going to go
We
away.
give you from the American Public Health Institute that rape is more likely to happen when there's a war. And
Was-
moreover, in your Guardian card, did they commit these abuses because they were losing or because they were winning?
They committed them because they literally said, we now believe we can do whatever we want.
Wait a
So
second.
if they believe that
I
they are
read their
winning.
evidence, it says we were embarrassed, defeated, we couldn't
No,
find a
it says, we now believe we can do what we want.
Okay,
At
no,
that point,
that's not getting what I'm saying. Long story short, have they just lost a battle or have they just won a battle?
they just won a battle.
No, they didn't. They lost a battle. At the
That's
point
just
where
not
the UN
true.
is
In
helping
fact,
them win battles.
That's not, wait,
do we
whoa,
not
whoa,
like
whoa. That's not true at all. Because here's the other reason why there's going to be an increase in these sexual
We're going
assaults
to another
and human
reason.
rights violations.
What I'm
No,
saying
no, no,
still
no,
stands.
no, it doesn't actually. Because the IPI evidence, which you failed to address, says that they then turn over land to the Congolese army. At that point,
Okay.
because they feel empowered, they then go on raping and committing massive human rights
Wait a second.
violations. But can I ask you
So
a
just
question?
because the Congolese army has land, that means they're going to rape people?
Yes,
Why?
exactly.
Why?
Because they're already prone to doing it.
Okay.
They've been in a
Are you ever telling me that the Congolese army are inherently bad people that are going to commit rapes? Or are they only committing rapes in the backdrop?
I'm telling you that they are A, inherently bad people, but we make it worse because we internationally back it. The only thing worse than rape is
Just
internationally
because
backed.
the UN has the same mission as the Congolese force doesn't mean that like we automatically endorse everything they're doing. But can we move on?
Sure.
What's your question?
Okay, so let's specifically talk about your argument where you talk about preventing genocide, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so how fast did the Rwandan genocide happen? Or, I guess
100 days, which is why UN peacekeepers are already on the ground.
we are going to run too fast.
Can I have a computer back?
I'm still here.
Looking at my first contention about the UN successes as worse, particularly regarding the humanitarian atrocities that the Congolese army is committing, by voting affirmative in today's round for my opponents, it perpetuates the problem of the United Nations condoning all of these humanitarian atrocities. And that problem is actually going to set the precedent for the future, that they allow it going into the future for all of these Congolese military and for the future reference and for future offensive operations to condone all of these humanitarian atrocities. Now, now my opponents try and say that it's a lack of government that causes the rape, but it's not the lack of government, but it's the government itself. The Congolese army themselves are the ones doing the raping. In fact, they've reported tens of thousands of cases of rape and sexual violence against kids and grown-ups alike. But also, it's the very mindset that my opponents have that solving just the conflict solves the entire problem itself, because it doesn't solve the problem. You have to have humanitarian aid there. Now, my opponents try and say that there's $17 million going to stop the problem. That's simply not true. It's only going to the victims after the problem happened. You could look at the card, please. But then you're going to look at my third contention about the conflict escalation. Now, my opponents try and say that there's actually there's less when there's less impartiality, you actually stop violence. That's simply not true, because it's the impartiality that allows for negotiations to occur. Now, in my opponent's world, you have to come in an offensive operation and actually pick a side. When you pick a side, you make the rebels mad. And when you make the rebels mad, what winds up happening is that it increases the recruitment for the region around them. And actually what winds up happening is that they start bombing the United Nations because they get more and more mad of the United Nations' presence. Now also, you're always going to look to caution over war, because in the fog of war, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of civilians going to be dead. But then, don't forget about what Shannon says, that in the wake of desperation, there's going to ramp up killings, ultimately perpetuating the cycle of genocide. But then, Valentino says that they're blaming the victim in overall killing them more. The biggest part in the round is the fact that military operation increases the arms in the region, leaving 3 million people insecure, and basically their livelihoods are lost. Thank you.
rebel groups are actually forced to the negotiation table, and we've seen the rebel groups basically be cut in half because of this offensive operations. Now, let's go over to the app case in the first contention. Our opponents try to say that, well, power vacuum is going to be created. But remember, when Delenn tells you, Voice of America says the number of groups is actually reduced from 50 to 20. So there are many benefits to see. Our opponents say that, well, groups are going to be able to increase recruitment because of increased collateral damage. But we tell you the largest operating group, the FDLR, in the Congo right now is actually reduced from 8,000 members to 1,000 members as a result of these offensive operations. So the recruitment is not increasing. They try to read you evidence from FSU about an 18% increase in casualties, but that's not specific to the UN. Now, we can also look towards the Atlantic, who explains that in the Côte d'Ivoire in 2011, offensive actions taken by peacekeepers actually deposed of a conflict-creating leader who refused to step down from power and almost plunged the country into civil war. So this is another independent issue why civil conflict wasn't prevented. But let's talk about genocide. Our opponents try to say genocide can't be prevented because of try to say that, well, there's been an influx of weapons to the region, but in genocide regions, there's already apparent stockpiling weapons, so that's not unique. And Dartmouth says that, when they try to say Dartmouth says the victims are going to be blamed, but in genocide regions, these actors aren't rational, they're already blaming the victims. At that point, offensive operations are uniquely going to benefit the victims because we're seeing that UN is basically stationed before conflict breaks out, and we can attack weapon stockpiles in both the CAR, and we could have been wrong.
So, let's specifically talk about where you get up and you go. They have like lots of special equipment to prevent genocide, right?
Yeah.
So why does that matter necessarily if they aren't mobilized quickly?
Let's just say they aren't.
Well, because you dropped the Henry
Right.
Stimson Center.
Okay, Brian, let's just talk about like what the United Nations does from a logical standpoint first, all right?
No,
So the UN is stationed in areas that are on the brink of conflict, right? So genocide. So
Not
they are the only actor in the world who can mobilize as quickly because they are already stationed in areas of conflict.
Not necessarily.
Why not?
There are two problems with that argument.
Why?
The first of which is that the people that are already stationed there are usually traditional peacekeepers.
But that's why we're advocating from a break in the status quo.
No, here's the problem though. At the point where they're already traditional peacekeepers, they can't actually transition effectively enough right now.
Brian,
to actually
we're
become
debating different worlds
Wait,
which
but-
would exist by
But
approach
really
on
quickly,
balance.
can I just give you my second reason why? It
Okay.
ties really well into the first reason. The second reason, which is the Stimson Center evidence, is it doesn't necessarily matter because governments have different political objectives. At that point, they're not
What
actually
gov-
going to mobilize the force in
All right,
time.
Glenn.
Peacekeepers are stationed in 16 countries as of right now.
Yes.
Those 16 countries have some form of conflict. In Rwanda, we tell you from past evidence that had they had the ability to use offensive force, we could have saved millions of people because they have the weapons.
tell you,
It's
sure.
easy as going into
They
a
could have
civil
access to all
war.
of
A pro
Do you
ballot.
mind if I quickly respond to
I mean,
that?
let me just finish.
Okay.
In a pro ballot, you vote for a role in which these peacekeepers do have offensive capabilities. Remember, the resolution says you allow UN peacekeepers to engage in offensive operations,
Do you mind if I
not the
mind if I-
Security Council, the peacekeepers themselves.
Okay, my first one?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's the problem with that. Now, Brian brings up the card that says the only reason why we weren't able to stop Rwanda was not because of the inability to act by the United Nations peacekeepers. Rather, it was the multilateralism and the United States stopping French forces.
Multilateralism.
You mind if I
Please finish. You're about to lot explaining your
So the problem with that is that the United States themselves stopped the French forces from going in and stopping it. That is the only reason
Ben.
why.
You can say that as much as you want. So basically, what I really wanted to say is that the peacekeepers were specifically asked to target stockpiles in Rwanda. As much as they want to say there was a lack of will, they were asked to, and their response was, we can't because of our mandate. They were not allowed to offensively
So,
engage
I
in
just really quickly respond to that and ask a question. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. The reason why they couldn't, and obviously we're going to go back and forth on this, is because the US blocked it. That's the problem with multilateralism, not the
Couple of
mandate.
things.
But can I ask you a question?
Well, no, I can respond.
Well,
Just
also
go
in
ahead.
worlds where you
Can I
go
respond
pro,
really
there's no
quickly?
Security Council needed.
I'm just
Like,
going
you're
to
investing the
wait.
power to conduct offensive operations with peacekeepers. The resolution doesn't say the Security Council should authorize it. It says UN peacekeepers should be able to conduct
Additionally,
offensive
nor does
operations.
the resolution say we have to solve for every instance.
I'm
So
telling you that you're
multilateralism
making the
isn't
problem
gonna
worse,
isn't gonna
because
block
usually they
some
blame
examples.
victims of
You can still
violence.
feel comfortable with pro ballot.
Just vote off
So
the
they're
left.
blaming the victims of violence who aren't actually the problem.
Are all five of them ready, right? Opponents? Any opposed? The first reason why you're going to be voting for us is because UN success is always going to be worse. Remember, we give you the evidence that specifically says that Congolese forces have committed even worse rights atrocities than the rebels. That goal is not responded to. Remember, that they condone humanity atrocities. It sets the precedent in the future that the Congolese army can do whatever they want. They say, hey, if we prevent the conflict, then we're going to solve everything else. But remember, that thinking perpetuates the mindset that once the conflict's over, that's going to solve all of these human rights violations.
without actually looking at those human rights violations. Remember that even during peace, they're raping tens of thousands of women when the land was given to the Congolese army by the UN peacekeeping operation. At the point where they're not being impartial, they're literally condoning the worst types of atrocities. That's going to be a reason, a moral obligation to sign your ballot. But then, the next place that you're going to vote is going to be that conflict always increases. Now remember, they never respond to the 5 reasons why conflict goes up. First, remember that now they are seen as an occupation force, so there's no recruitment. At that point, even though the recruitment was down, now in the long term what we see is there's more violence against UN bases and 120 revenge killings, which is the second reason why. Remember that when rebels feel threatened, they ramp up killings out of desperation. That's why 120 people were massacred in the Congo recently. But then, my third reason is that in the fog of war, remember, when you get rid of the ambiguity of the mandate, they then act offensively. In the fog of war, they kill more civilians, that's more lives lost. But then, fourthly, remember that Valentino, which never gets responded to, it's the reason why you sign your ballot, is because when they go in to try to stop genocide, the perpetrators of violence then blame the victims, and they ramp up the killings. That is exactly what happened in Kosovo. That is a moral obligation, again, to sign your ballot. But last but not least, remember the arms race argument. Remember that in the Sahel, 3 million people were actually lost all sources of livelihood, increased food security, and increased conflict. Because there's more arms, because they feel threatened. And because overall, there's a worse world when they're offensive. I can see nothing but a negative ballot. Thank you.